Downing Street. One well-placed source told us that Gaddafi will accept calls from just two Britons. The first is Prince Andrew, a standard-bearer for British business. The other is Mr. Blair. The former PM was hired in January last year as a senior advisor by JP Morgan Chase, the global financial services giant. Which is perhaps why Mr. Blair's intermittent presence in Tripoli has raised eyebrows in some quarters. The Conservative chair of the all-party parliamentary Libyan group is Daniel Korczynski.
My Libyan sources tell me that he's a frequent visitor to Libya. I have no reason to doubt what my Libyan sources are telling me about this. They are at the highest levels of Libyan authorities, and I have had corroboration of this from other United Kingdom sources who have dealings in Libya.
But Mr. Blair has new employers now, as we know, in JP Morgan Chase. And frankly, Mr. Blair is a private citizen now. Why shouldn't he pursue business links on behalf of his new employers?
Don't want to cast aspersions, but I think questions have to be asked to make sure that Mr. Blair is not making any financial gains from those previous discussions, vital negotiations between himself and Colonel Gaddafi, when he convinced Colonel Gaddafi to give up weapons of mass destruction. In return for what, I'm not sure. I have tried repeatedly to contact his office, telephoning, sending emails and other official correspondence. He refuses to reply. We don't get any acknowledgements.
How many times have you attempted to get an answer from Mr. Blair about this?
I have personally tried to contact his office on 9 separate occasions by writing, and no reply at all.
No acknowledgement even?
No acknowledgement at all.
We also contacted Mr. Blair's office, asking how many times the former PM had visited Tripoli in the last 12 months and why. No answer was forthcoming. However, we did receive an email from Mr. Blair's spokesman, Matthew Doyle, who decided to answer an entirely different question, telling us that
Mr. Blair thinks UK-Libya trade is a good thing and he's totally supportive of British business working in Libya. Now that Libya is off the list of terrorist-sponsoring states and is open to foreign business, it would be absurd if UK business were not to take advantage of the change in circumstances.
Next, we spoke to JP Morgan Chase. We asked whether they could confirm that Mr. Blair had been conducting business for JP Morgan while in Tripoli over the last year. We were told they would not comment on Mr. Blair, only on their banking activities. So we asked whether the firm, which is a member of the Libyan British Business Council, would comment on its business activities in Libya. We were told, very politely, that it would not. Scratch a little deeper at Britain's Byzantine diplomatic relations with Tripoli, and more questions rear their heads. And none has caused more controversy recently than the UK government's denial that Mr. Al-Megrahi's release was linked to trade.
The idea that the British government and the Libyan government would sit down and somehow barter over the freedom or the life of this Libyan prisoner and make it form part of some business deal, and then what do you expect? London to phone up the Scottish Nationalist administration in Edinburgh and say, now let him out? I mean, it's not only wrong, it's completely implausible and actually quite offensive.
Business Secretary Peter Mandelson at the height of the storm. The reaction from across the Atlantic, meanwhile, was one of cold fury.
Well, I couldn't believe it. I was stunned that anybody would think that a mass murderer of 270 people deserved compassionate release so that he could spend his last few months with his family. I just was astounded by it. I couldn't put into words what my reaction was.
John Bolton, former US ambassador to the United Nations.
What stunned me when I heard about it, and what stuns me to this day, is that the British government would let it happen and that the Obama administration failed so miserably in persuading our best ally in the whole world not to do this thing. So for Scotland / the United Kingdom to release Megrahi, I think is an act of bad faith. It's just disingenuous to say that there wasn't a London interest in the Scottish decision, and a huge act of bad faith to say that Washington's views shouldn't have been taken into account. In fact, with 189 dead out of 270 being Americans, I would have said that by vote of the ghosts of those who were murdered, we should have had the predominant view.
Ambassador Bolton, who was part of the Bush administration's team which negotiated Libya's renouncement of WMD, says sensitive deals struck at high-level summits are rarely committed to paper and ink.
Politicians and statesmen know how to accomplish what they want to accomplish without taking out a pencil and a back of an envelope and signing it. Look, I've been in meetings with secretaries of state and foreign ministers where one side has started out by saying, okay, now we're not going to reach any decisions in this meeting. We're going to be able to walk out of here and say we discussed the issue but came to no conclusions. And the other side will not. And then they'll have discussions and reach conclusions. But they've agreed that it's not really a decision. No final decision has been made, no deal, no linkage. Everybody's clear on that, when in fact you get the same outcome. It's simply an issue of sequencing.
But while Downing Street denies bartering over Mr al-Megrahi's release, it's an open secret that in Gaddafi's Libya, politics seeps into every corner of commerce. What's more, no significant trade agreements are signed off without the leader's say-so. Charles Gurdon, who advises companies setting up in Libya and other volatile markets.
I think really the key is the relationship between politics and business. Throughout the last 40 years, Gaddafi has always rewarded his political friends and has punished his political enemies. And those countries which are prepared to do what he wants have received favours. And if a country supports Gaddafi in whatever he wants, then their companies are rewarded.
If Mr al-Megrahi had died in Scotland, in prison, what impact do you think that would have had on Scottish and British trade?
I think in the short to medium term it would have been disastrous. I think there's no doubt that British companies would have been put at the back of the queue, Scottish companies would as well, and I think that it would have done irrevocable damage as far as Britain's trade relations with Libya.
One British businessman we spoke to had shared Dr. Gurdon's fears about a possible backlash from the Libyan authorities if the Lockerbie bomber had died in jail. He told us that if Mr al-Megrahi had perished in Scotland, he expected that his invoices would have remained unpaid. Like others we spoke to in UK businesses operating in Libya, he declined to be interviewed for this programme. But his jitteriness is easy to understand. After all, if the Gaddafi regime is crossed, an international row can erupt, which is precisely what happened to the Swiss. In August 2008, Colonel Gaddafi's son, Hannibal, and his wife were arrested in a hotel in Geneva for allegedly assaulting two of their servants. Lawyer Françoise Montbrez represented the servants.
They had no right to go out, they had to work 20 hours a day, and above all, they have been severely beaten by Mr. Hannibal Gaddafi and his wife. It happened very frequently. The situation was very difficult.
What sort of injuries did the servants sustain?
There were marks on their bodies. They have been visited doctors in hospitals. The woman also describes to have been beaten with coat hanger, and on the top of that, witnesses have confirmed. So the file in the hands of the police and of the investigating magistrate was very strong.
Although Hannibal and his wife were released, an investigation by the Swiss authorities was launched. Libya retaliated in a variety of ways, including by recalling diplomats from Switzerland and withdrawing vast deposits from Swiss banks. And Swiss nationals in Tripoli felt the heat too.
The response was to ban any Swiss firm from the country. The Swiss firms present in the country were given 45 days to quit Libya. And the response was also that two Swiss citizens were detained in a prison in Tripoli. They are still forbidden to go out from Libya. Also, the family of one of my clients, his mother was detained and his brother was also detained. The mother was eventually released in August 2008. The brother disappeared. And nowadays, I'm still not sure if he is still disappeared or if he died.